Dr. Martha Chaiklin is an historian and an independent curator, currently based in Maryland, USA. She obtained a PhD at Leiden University. Her major publications include Cultural Commerce and Dutch Commercial Culture, 2003, and Ivory and the Aesthetics of Modernity in Meiji Japan, 2014. She's translated C.T. Essenwolf's De Cognics, I hope I'm right, a pioneer in Yokohama in 2012, and edited Asian Material Culture, 2009, Animal Trade Histories in the Indian Ocean World, 2020. She brings us a whiff of India through Sandalwood in early modern Japan. Is an interesting subject and interesting memories also.
Okay, well, I did call it a whiff of India because smell is probably the least studied of the five senses. It tickles the appetite, it helps calm the nerves, it stimulates the brain. Aromas evoke powerful memories of a person or a place or an event. Unpleasant smells can ruin pretty much anything. Thus, the materials that emit pleasant aromas have been pretty much universally valued and traded since ancient times. And sandalwood is archetypical of this. But even though the fragrance is what makes sandalwood one of the most valuable woods in the world, its effect on all the five senses underlays its demand in Japan. So this broad spectrum of olfactory, auditory, tactile, oral, and visual stimulation contributed to its value as a luxury material with properties of conspicuous consumption. Sandalwood consumption was a visceral linkage between India, Southeast Asia, and Japan that expanded even as Japan became more isolated. The high value, both monetary and cultural, has led to a number of woods from entirely different genera being called sandalwood. So, for example, Okay, so green sandalwood is what we see here. That's also called vera wood, and that's a deciduous plant found in South America, which, although also fragrant, and one of its many uses is perfume, was not used in Asia in pre-modern times. Although they are two different species and have somewhat different properties and applications, this paper will focus on what is commonly known as true white or yellow sandalwood. Sorry, it's obvious enough, but I'm having trouble finding it, which you can see here, and I'm sure you're all familiar with. And what's also called red sanders or red sandalwood. Now, in pre-modern, and these woods do link India, Southeast Asia, and Japan. They're often treated as varieties of the same thing in pre-modern Japan in Japanese literature. So while I tried to be as precise as possible when I could be, sometimes they're treated together. I could not always distinguish which kind of wood was referred to when. So through the introduction of Buddhism, non-indigenous sandalwood became integral to Japan because of the many images and objects involved in Buddhist worship. Although, according to ancient records, the first sandalwood drifted to the shores of Awaji Island in the third year of the reign of the Empress Suiko, which is in 595. The locals intended to burn it, but Prince Shotoku realized that it was a rare wood from southern India, which I learned yesterday did not necessarily mean South India, and had it carved into a statue of Kannon, the Guanyin in Chinese, the goddess of mercy. While this story may very well be apocryphal, the carving of Buddhist images, which were called danzo, out of sandalwood, was introduced to Japan by the 730s. Through various Chinese texts. Danzo were commissioned to commemorate the dead and important personal events like recovery from illness and childbirth. And these are all national treasures that I've shown here. So through these associations, when available, sandalwood was by extension used for other representations like Tainan Butsu, which you can also see here, which are these small statues placed inside of the larger ones. to suffuse them with a spiritual resonance. Sandalwood was also widely used in portable shrines called dangan and rosary beads. And the difficulty in obtaining sandalwood is evident in the exceptions allowed in Japanese Buddhist practice for native Japanese woods like kaya, which is Japanese nutmeg, and hinoki, or Japanese cypress, being the most common. Perhaps more significant than images from the sandalwood perspective was incense. And it is thought to purify the space, evoke the Buddha, bring inner peace, and enhance meditation. Sandalwood was not the only ingredient used for incense, of course, but it was an essential component in incense formulations for specific rites and also the most common. Although not as fragrant, red sandalwood was nevertheless used in some incense as well. The religious connotations of sandalwood even extended outside the strict confines of Buddhism. I Ching fortune-telling sticks could sometimes be made of red sandalwood. Shinto images were sometimes made of sandalwood, and incense found its way into some Shinto ritual as well. Sandalwood always made associations with Buddhism, but its qualities soon led to secular use. Early evidence can be found in the Shosoin, which is the treasure house of personal effects from Emperor Shomu, who reigned from 724 to 749, and were then donated to Todaiji Temple by his widow. The objects from the Shosoin are a good indicator. That's probably too small to see, but they're a good indicator of the kinds of things that the elites from this period used. And in addition to these instruments, you can see there's a game board, incense burners, knife handles, things like that from red sandalwood. And from white sandalwood, there are scroll spindles, boxes, beads, and incense. So all these are echoed in the very famous Tale of Genji, which mentions a few additional uses like book storage, chests, and trays. In the gatehouse, for example, which is chapter 16 in the modern compilation, a competition in which artworks were compared was held. And the left team presented their artwork in boxes made of red sandalwood, and the right did theirs in boxes of aloes wood. Incense had wide-ranging uses outside of religious ritual in Heian Japan. Delicate and expensive layers of silk clothing were washed only infrequently and were instead aired and scented with incense. Incense was also burned in rooms to freshen and provide atmosphere. And it was even used to establish sort of a presence and personality among an aristocratic elite who mostly interacted from behind screens. Like the comparison of artwork mentioned above, various sorts of aesthetic competitions were popular amusements for the aristocracy, and incense, which was part of daily life, yet also a luxury, was the in the Heian period, and this included incense connoisseurship. So the first such gathering that has been recorded was held in the 9th century by Prince Kaya, a 7th son of Emperor Kamu. And Prince Kaya, along with Fujiwara Fujitsugu, codified what is now called the sixth sense, which are special incense blends to the Japanese taste, all of which use sandalwood. The scent of sandalwood definitely filled the lives of the Heian aristocracy. So where did all this sandalwood come from? By the 15th century, Japanese sailors were also sailing at least to Sumatra to obtain their own sandalwood, some of which was then even re-exported to Korea. Trade generally increased throughout the entire pre-modern period. Transshipment was common because sandalwood of both types was harvested from undeveloped forested regions and then sold to the developed ones. So it is kind of difficult to ascertain precisely the actual origin, but existing records suggest that Timor was a significant source for sandalwood in international trade in the early modern period. It is also nearly impossible to provide accurate data for the amounts of sandalwood imported into Japan for several reasons. First, though the records of the first part of the century are spotty at best. Second, sometime in the late 17th century, the VOC, that's the Dutch East India Company, switched from selling sandalwood as part of company trade in Japan to private trade. And for most years, there are not records of private trade, at least that were preserved in the VOC archives. So very little evidence remains, but supplies for private trade were usually acquired in Batavia or Java today, another site for transit shipment. The amounts brought in private trade could nevertheless be significant, amounting in 1831, for example, to 150 pickles. Dutch records of Chinese trade show that sandalwood supplies of both kinds tended toward drought and glut. This graph only shows an approximation because in some years, as all of you who have worked with pre-modern sources know, some years they use weights, which is here, it's in caddies. Some years they just write logs. Other years it was like bunches. So there's no way to accurately assume. And there are also years for which nothing was reported for Chinese trade, but we can assume that Dutch traders almost certainly brought some as well. But you can also see that the supply definitely increases as the Edo period progresses. The vast majority of sandalwood was imported in an unfinished state, with the rare exception of a few trays, some pen sets, some cups, things like that. And in addition, some imports are listed that might have contained sandalwood, but are entered as general categories like incense or medicine or beads. But their sandalwood content is speculation. Increased supplies and standard of living in early modern Japan led to wider and varied use. It was, for example, an important part of the tea ceremony, which had developed in the late 16th century. And it was burned prior to the arrival of guests, so the scent would linger in the room. Kodo, which is usually translated as incense ceremony, developed about the same time as the tea ceremony and was also widely practiced among those who had means. It shares the goal of clearing the mind of the pressures of life and the connoisseurship inherent in the tea ceremony. So while Kodo is focused on the nose, it also engages other senses. Sight and touch are intrinsic to the appreciation of the formal implements used to engage in the ceremony, while the experience of engaging with and identifying the incense is literally called listening. So this oral aspect is further enhanced by its connections with poetry. The olfactory nuances are intended to echo the nuances of the poems. Thus, even when the poems are not recited, by evoking the poems, they produce sort of an internalized sound. Sandalwood incense was also used in a completely different kind of sensory experience at the licensed brothel quarters. Incense clocks were calculated time by the burning rate of the incense. Sometimes different types of incense were used to designate different hours, so the user could tell the time without actually looking at the burned incense. Even after mechanical clocks were produced in Japan in the late 16th century, incense clocks were relatively inexpensive compared to mechanical clocks. Early incense clocks used powdered incense, but by the Edo period, as you can see by the one on the bottom right, stick incense was used because it was made from hardened sandalwood paste, and that was much more accurate. So each stick was about a half an hour. Incense sticks were used for a wide variety of timed activities, including work time and poetry competitions, for watchmen's shifts, the dosing of medicine, and scientific experiments. By the mid-Edo period, fragrances like sandalwood were added to other personal care products like makeup, soap, hair oil, and toothpaste. It was put in small bags and carried about the person, both for the aroma, but also because it was believed to have medicinal properties. Both red and white sandalwood were used for healing battle wounds from at least the mid-14th century. It was used topically for skin disorders and as a coolant, and sandalwood oil was used for muscle aches. The Nagasaki magistrates frequently requested sandalwood oil from the Dutch doctor, and 500 bottles of this were imported through Chinese traders in 1815. Thus, using sandalwood oil was also about the sense of touch. In addition, the Dutch supplied small amounts to doctors not including in trade records. Sandalwood enhanced taste directly through consumption, whether through medicine or there was a sweet called nishikibama that had powdered white sandalwood kneaded into the dough. Red sandalwood could also be used as a dye for foodstuffs and textiles too. Sandalwood was also employed for quasi-medicinal uses like facial toner. So white sandalwood, along with cloves, rose petals, and other ingredients were distilled using in a device that's called a rambiki. And this was made into, at least first and most famously, a product called hana no tsuyu, which translates as dew of flowers. And this toner remained popular through the Edo period. It was supposed to give the users a golden glow. And sandalwood was believed to whiten the skin and reduce shine and decrease pore size, things we all still worry about. So while Kodo aficionados listened to incense, red sandalwood was important to the Edo period soundscape in a much more literal sense through instruments, especially the shamisen. So this choice was partly aesthetic and partly because of the rich red tones, but it also had to do with the hardness of the wood and the tones that the residents produced. A fairly hard, dense wood was required for the neck of the shamisen because the pressure would cause it to wear and warp over time. Moreover, a soft wood would absorb too much sound, depriving the shamisen of its distinctive twang. A balance was required of those qualities that derived from the strings and body that was also often made from red sandalwood. Indian red sandalwood with wavy grains is even the most expensive material. So that's the one on the bottom. And this type wood is given a completely separate name. It's called koki. Red sandalwood was used in a variety of instruments, including drums, koto, and kokyo, which you might not be familiar with, which is the shamisen that looks that she's using the bow. And you can see the grain in the picture on the bottom. Of the many kinds of objects made from sandalwood, some examples with visual and tactile appeal include the use of as a base for nakra, inlay in wood mosaics, in bows, which weren't articles of war because that'd be kind of wasteful, but for recreational shooting and also sword and knife sheaths and hilts. The visual, olfactory, and tactile properties also made sandalwood desirable for personal accoutrements. Fans with sandalwood ribs were used and possibly imported since they were another trade object lacking specification, wafting the scent of sandalwood with each letter. There was a dramatic change to women's hairstyles during the Edo period, from long straight hair bound at the neck to increasingly elaborate chignons, minimized washing, and required hair oil to stiffen the tresses, which were infused sometimes with sandalwood oil and might be adorned with sandalwood ornamental and functional combs and hair ornaments. Sandalwood was also used for male accessories like pipe cases and tobacco cases, netsuke, inro, and ojime. Perhaps nothing speaks to the increase in supply as the occasional incorporation of sandalwood into architectural features. The Shingoten wing of the Katsura detached palace, constructed in 1660 outside of Kyoto, for example, has an entire shelf of red sandalwood. There is even record of a luxurious river pleasure boat, a yakadabune, with an entire ceiling of sandalwood. To conclude, sandalwood is unique among the imports into pre-modern Japan because of the wide variety of ways in which it was put to use. Red and white sandalwood, although different plants, were often viewed as varieties of the same thing and were often used in similar manner. Because traders were essentially middlemen buying from ports where sandalwood had been transshipped rather than going into the forest to cut the trees down themselves, it is difficult to report with certainty of its origin. Some of it may have come from India, but most of it probably came from Southeast Asia. There was, however, a definitive awareness of its connections with India, and as such represented India's presence in Japanese daily life. Introduced as a corollary of Buddhism, sandalwood maintains those connections even today. Yet the wide range of sensory appeal led to many other uses. In the hierarchy of senses, olfactory remained at the top. The fragrance of sandalwood used to create incense, cover bad smells on the body, clothing, or environment, or even mark time. The rich red color of red sandalwood, whether as a contrast in wood inlay, personal accoutrements, or red dye, or just to please the eye. Medicine and food affected taste. Tactile properties also led to use in personal accoutrements like combs and netsuke. And acoustic properties enhanced the oral landscape through a wide variety of instruments. Imported goods were important in the material life of early modern Japan, from wool used to make jimbauri, which are those armor surcoats, or the tortoiseshell that was the de rigueur for women's hair ornaments, but none of them engaged with the entire spectrum of human sensory experience that sandalwood did. It linked Japan directly to the trade system of the Indian Ocean and beyond, and viscerally evoked India and Southeast Asia in a society in isolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.